All right, we'll go ahead and get started. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Oluchi Okafor, and I will be moderating the conversation today on contemporary Black liberation movements as part of the University of Pittsburgh's Anti-Black Racism course. And so today we have our two very special guests, Bree Newsom Bass and Darnell More. And so today we're essentially going to be discussing some of the tactics and strategies that artists and activists use in their intersectional resistance to anti-Black racism on the local, national, and international levels. And so the posed lecture question today that I want you guys to keep in mind are, how are activists today challenging anti-Black racism? And then what are the unique challenges of organizing for change in the current political climate? So I'll first start off by doing bios, by introducing myself. My name is Oluchi Okafor. My pronouns are she, they. I'm a senior here at the University of Pittsburgh, completing my degree in Africana Studies and Political Science. During my time as an undergraduate, I've done a couple of things. So I've conducted research in New York as part of the Office of Undergraduate Research New York Field Studies program. And over there, I got to meet a lot of cool people and do work on environmental justice and environmental racism with Dr. Michael Glass and Dr. Tessa Proppins as my faculty mentors. And so my research essentially focused on the impacts of environmental injustices on respiratory health disparities, especially in communities of color. And so right now I'm currently working on a project that involves a photo interview blog on Instagram entitled Humans of Environmental Injustice. It's kind of like a spinoff from the Humans of New York page. And it essentially highlights the stories of people that are living in communities impacted by environmental injustices, and also provides other additional resources about environmental justice in general. And outside of my research, I work as an assistant teacher in the Hill District. I'm the vice president of the Association of Black Political Science Students. I'm a writer for the Black Action Society's magazine, Blackline, and I'm a member of the Pitt Student Civic Engagement Council. So that's all about me. I know you guys are not here to listen to me talk all day, so I'm gonna go ahead and introduce our next guest, which is Miss Bree Newsom Bass. Her pronouns are she, her. Bree Newsom Bass is an artist, activist, and public speaker. She's an organizer in the modern civil rights movement and has helped develop several nonprofits and grassroots organizations. In 2015, she attracted national attention when she scaled a flagpole at South Carolina's Capitol building to remove the Confederate battle flag in protest of systemic racism following the racially motivated murders at Emmanuel A. M&E in Charleston, South Carolina. Her artistic works include written film and performance pieces. She is the recipient of the NAACP Image Award, among her other honors. Welcome today, Bree Newsom.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. And so our second guest today is Darnell More. His pronouns are he, him, his. Darnell More is the author of the 2019 Lambda Literary Award memoir, No Ashes in the Fire, Coming of Age, Black and Free in America, which was listed as a 2018 New York Times notable book and a Barnes & Noble's Discover Greater New Writers Pick. Moore is also a writer in residence at the Center of African American Religion, Sexual Politics, and Social Justice at Columbia University, and a 2019 Senior Fellow at the Annenberg Innovation Lab at the University of Southern California. His writings have appeared in the New York Times Book Review, Playboy, Vice, The Guardian, The Nation, Ebony, and other outlets. He's the Director of Inclusion Strategy for Content and Marketing at Netflix, and he is currently working on his second book, which is tentatively titled Unbecoming, Visions Beyond the Limits of Manhood. Darnell, thank you for joining us today.
Really honored to be here.
Awesome. All right, so to get things rolling, we're gonna start off with Bree, who will be starting off with the dialogue to essentially share with us what she has to say about contemporary Black liberation, past Black liberation, and possibly future Black liberations. So Bree, I'll go ahead and hand it off to you.
Yeah, certainly. And give me a time limit, because I'll make sure I don't ramble.
5 to 10 minutes.
Okay, sure. So in my view, I really view Black liberation as an evolving thing, right? When we often talk about Black consciousness, I think that this is something that has evolved over time, right? The whole experience of enslavement, the experience of colonization, even going through the process of racialization, right? And people often talk about like the creation of the Negro. This is something that was forced onto us. And so when we are developing language, when we are developing resistance, this is something that has developed as a process over time. And so I know, speaking from my experience, I the point at which I like consciously made this decision, like, yes, I'm, entering into this movement. I'm dedicating a significant part of my life, or dedicating my life really, going forward to this cause. A big part of that was recognizing that I was stepping into something that began long before I got here, right? So, we talk about the Black Lives Matter movement that has become the, popular term for this like current iteration of a struggle. And I think it's important to recognize too, we can kind of pinpoint ebbs and flows and, certain like movements within the overall movement. I think you can say that about really any kind of movement, but certainly with, Black liberation, we talk about, for instance, the civil rights movement, right? That we talk about a particular era there. We talk about the Black Power era. And so when we're talking about this modern movement, when we pinpoint it, kind of tracing it back to like Trayvon Martin or the Gen 6 as kind of being like when that swell began, again, it's important to recognize this is a modern iteration of something that existed long before, right? So, and that's why it is so key for us to have these conversations. Like, I don't ever consider myself an expert as much as I speak on panels, and I love to, share from my personal experience. I never reach a point where I say, I know all there is to know. I've studied all there is to study, right? It is, you know what I mean? Like, I think part of committing ourselves to the struggle is committing ourselves to constant study. And a lot of it is theory. We constantly talk about theory and praxis. That's a very real thing. We have theories. We are theorizing around, describing the current systems and situations, giving language to those things. Language is a constant evolving thing within the movement. Even in terms of identifying ourselves as Black. I mean, that is an ongoing thing. This dialogue over should Black be capitalized? I mean, how are we defining ethnicity versus race? How are we understanding our identities within the diaspora, right? And within the struggle? This is all a part of it. So there is a lot of theorizing, and then there is praxis. Like, there is how are we applying these theories, right, to building actual concrete practices for liberation. And that is a constant ongoing thing. We never reach a point where it's like, okay, we figured it all out, and it's in this manual from this cover to that cover. And if you're trying to figure out this thing, you flip to this chapter. Like, it doesn't really work that way. I think it's really interesting. Oftentimes when I'm speaking on panels or having conversations, people will ask me questions like, how do you build a coalition? Or, how do you find common language? And I'm like, well, that really describes the work itself. I mean, that describes the process itself. And I mean, I can tell you, and I, plan to talk about it today, in terms of some of what that looks like in practice and how we're trying to figure it out. But I think it's just so key to recognize that it is an evolving thing. When we talk about decolonizing, when we talk about Black liberation in the present and particularly in the future, we're really talking about a thing that has not existed yet. And I think that's important for us to recognize too, right? So, I identify with Afrofuturism. I love talking about Black futures, because I don't think it is about a returning to, in my view. There is no returning to. We cannot undo history. We cannot undo slavery and colonialism. I am a product of slavery and colonialism. I wouldn't be sitting here in North Carolina speaking to you in English, right? Had we not gone through this traumatizing experience that we have been going through for centuries. And so when we are theorizing, not just around like, how are we resisting current systems, but what are we fighting for? How are we building towards that? That is really about theorizing a world that has yet to exist, right? A post-colonial, post-white supremacist world that has yet to exist. And it is informed in some ways by the past. That's why history is so important, because we can't actively resist, particularly white supremacy, without recognizing and understanding the world before white supremacy. Because part of the lie of white supremacy and the way that it is taught to us, the process of colonization that we have gone through, has always been about this battle over history and constant historical erasure and trying to get us to believe that things have always been this way, right? It's always been white people ruling the world. That's the natural order of things. And so for that reason, it is key to understand both our history before this struggle and our history through this struggle, but also recognizing that what we are talking about is something that has yet to exist. And I think that is really important to understand in terms of why it doesn't just happen overnight. And it's not just, because if it were very easy, if it were something for us to just fall into, if we talk about a post-slavery world, that's a new world. We've got to understand that. If we're talking about a post-patriarchal world, that's a new world. And it can be possible. It's absolutely possible. But we have to recognize that that is something we have to consciously build and work towards. And so that's kind of like how I define the work itself, is that it's kind of like identifying where we are right now, well, where we have been, where we are now, where we're trying to go, and what are all the steps between those points, right? And key to understanding like how we get from where we are to where we want to go is recognizing how we got from where we were to where we are. Okay. I mean, that's key to understand too. Again, did not just happen overnight. One of the dangers I feel in the constant erasure of particularly the history of struggle, right, is, and people have spoken to this before, but just this false idea that progress just comes with time. Like a lot of people really think that it's like, time just goes by and we're just like on this train of progress and things just get better and better, like as we go. And that's not true. And we are seeing now, if it were not clear to everyone how untrue and how dangerous it is to fall into that false notion, because things can very easily turn back. And see, one of the key things to understand about like our recent history just in the past century or so is we had more rights and freedoms like right after the Civil War than we did 100 years later. Okay. So it is possible, just as it was possible to have, elected Black representatives in the 1870s and then go 100 years without any representatives and, 100 years of Jim Crow. And, you go from a whole bunch of people voting to not being able to vote at all. It is very possible in our lifetimes, if we're not conscious and if we're not engaging in conscious struggle, for Black people to have fewer rights, 30, 40 years from now than we do right now. And that's why it's so critical to operate with that kind of historical consciousness about what we are doing and where we are going.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So if you guys didn't get that, the past, the present, and where we're going is very important. And theory is also very important to that. So I'll go ahead and hand it off to Darnell next to talk about his experiences and his thoughts on contemporary Black liberation.
Sure. First, I want to thank Professors Lundy and Blaine for inviting us to be part of this conversation, to join your class. And also just to say a word to Bree, who I've had the privilege of just being in virtual spaces with and who I've celebrated on many occasions, but this is the first time where we get to be together. And I just want to say to you while I have you in front of me virtually, thank you for all you do for us and for your love for Black people and for your love for justice. I want to just reflect on the moment that we're in. I realize that we are having a virtual conversation because you, Oluchi, and your classmates are having to do distance learning. You all are in virtual engagement because we are talking and through a pandemic where it's situated. And I just want to be able to ground ourselves in that. And what that means for many of us, and particularly for Black and Latinx and Native folk. Not only, I call this a storm within a storm. We're in the middle of a global pandemic that revealed and exacerbated. It revealed the ways that anti-Black racism and all of its contingent structural inequities have shaped our lives in such a way that even within a natural occurrence like a global pandemic, we find ourselves still being disproportionately impacted, meaning our people are dying more, our people are being exposed and impacted by COVID more because of a range of things, more likely sort of to be living in neighborhoods that are overly and densely populated, more likely to be what we're calling frontline workers and people who are working within low wage positions and also positions in which they are being exposed to large groups of people. Even as we're experiencing the everyday reverberations of anti-Black racism, whether that's exercised through law enforcement and other machineries within the country. So I just want to start there to say that we're having this conversation about resistance, the history of resistance, within a moment that has put into sharp relief our need to always be ever vigilant and thoughtful about the ways that anti-Blackness works, even in a pandemic. As we are masked and at home, we also find ourselves still being killed on the street. So now, right, by law enforcement. So there's that too. So I just want to say to the students and everybody gathered here that it's okay for us not to be okay in moments like this, that it is worth acknowledging that this is a very unprecedented historical moment for you all, in that you're having to finish school, go through school, live a life, worry about family, some family members who may have been sick. Some of us have mourned the loss of people we have lost in this moment because of it. But the storm, that with the storm within a storm, I know American Psychological Association, for instance, talked about the racial pandemic that is actually has been exacerbated and raging for so long. But this particular moment that we're in had so many precipitating points. Yeah, we not only are living through all of this, but we have a government in place right now, in which really we have a president who rode the wave of xenophobic sentiment, of sexist, misogynistic sentiment, not just sentiment, but actual lived out expression and manifested reality, anti-Blackness, someone who was trying to override and push for more laws to be put up such that immigrant communities could not be here. I mean, we can go down the line, but what I want to say about this moment, which might feel so different or new to so many of us on this conversation, right? Because we haven't seen the technologies of anti-Black racism and its antecedents have always existed. So it's not that we didn't know that racism exists. It's not that we didn't know that when people, this notion of sort of make America grin, which was also repeated by people like Reagan, has at its core sentiments around patriotism that are deeply, deeply lodged with an imagination that looks at white men as being central to success and livability in the American project, right? But what were the precipitations? So you do realize that the movement for Black lives, as we know it, as Bree rightly named, another iteration of a long struggle for Black liberation, didn't just start when Trump got into the White House, right? BLM as an organizing principle actually got started when a Black president, Obama, was at the White House, which tells you something about the ways that anti-Blackness functions regardless of who our representative leaders are, identity politics notwithstanding. And I think that that's interesting to note, right? Because folk took to the streets, Bree went on a flagpole when we had a Black president in office. When we had and that threw into sharp relief this crisis of sort of political representation, this crisis of representation, and what it meant for those of us like me, right, like who took to the streets when Obama got in office with tears rolling down my eyes, only to discover that even when as a Black president in the office, it will not stop a bullet from coming out of a law enforcement person's gun, shooting our folk on the streets, or a white person who deputized themselves as vigilante, killing people, we had immigrants who were being sent back and deported when Obama was in the White House, right? And at the same time, as Black people who were contending with what it meant to deal with that and push back against some of the more violent policies that were impacting our communities under Black president, still having to go out and push back against white folk who were drawing pictures of Michelle Obama, who they caricatured as an ape. Are people who were really like just relentlessly going against Obama within the Senate and within the Congress because he was Black. So there was this we were already in this sort of process of having to hold that tension. So we get to a Trump because of the various precipitating events that were happening while Obama's in the White House, right? And here we are. But this moment is so compelling to me, and what I've been thinking about a lot, in addition to all of what Bree said, the connection she's made between the fact that our president is so much, it's contingent upon where we've been, and also deeply committed. The work is deeply committed to connected to where we're going, which is why I think this point about abolitionism in this moment is really important to bring up. When Ruth E. Wilson Gilmore defines abolitionism, she talks about it not only as the removal of the things that are destroying our communities, but imagining into being a developing of the things that are not yet here that need to be in place of all the bad things that do us harm. And that principle, that organizing principle, and one, by the way, that has really been brought to us by the legacies of people like Du Bois, right? But Black feminists, really, within our current iteration, Angela Davis, Marian Kaba, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, that their political theorization is centering itself, and our movement work says so much about not only the power of Black women, and I'm not trying to turn women into sort of like the superhuman who also doesn't hurt. But what I'm trying to say is that we have been gifted with an intersectional, even a use of intersectional, Kimberly Crenshaw and Black feminists before her who talked about simultaneity of oppression. So much of what I love about this moment, even as we are fighting against a behemoth, is the fact that we have an organizing principle that's deeply shaped by Black feminist thought, whether that be abolitionism or the fact that you have a movement community that's saying, when we say Black Lives Matter, there is not an invisible cishet Black Lives Matter in front of that. All Black Lives Matter. And if any of us are going to name that as a mantra, we have to remember that our politics need to be so expansive that it is imagining the Black person who is living their lives at the edges of the margins as a starting place for liberation. And I say to people all the time, if you got your Black Lives Matter shirt on, or if you're in your Black Lives Matter protest, and you don't necessarily feel that every Black life, and you don't know, you willfully forget to believe that the lives of every Black person, whether sex workers or trans folk or whoever matter, take the shirt off, put your sign down, go back home and pick up some reading and enhance your consciousness, because that's what is the moment is demanding of us right now, right? That to me is at the heart of what abolitionism is trying to get us to sort of imagine. It is a call for us to build and put into place the things that don't exist and to remove the things that don't. And at the heart of abolitionism is what Bree was getting at, is a faith. Because what we're trying to build, as she said, is a thing that is not yet here. And I'm borrowing that. Jose Munoz is a queer theorist who passed, who defined queerness as the not yet here. I think that's a remarkable way, right? Mm-hmm. To think about a political imagination that demands of us to imagine what isn't yet here that we need. Which lastly, I'll end here by talking about the power of the arts. Scholars, historians like Robin D.G. Kelley, for example, who talks about the Black radical imagination and freedom dreams, his whole work is around uplifting, at least that book, the value of art, of Black art, as a modality for transformation. Yes, we can disrupt. Yes, we can do policy change. Yes, we can begin to mobilize and create communities on our own terms. And it's also necessary to realize that art and Black art and culture has always been central to our movement work. That is at the crux what it means to have a freedom dream. It's been the engine, the gasoline fuel for our freedom dreams. And I love freedom dream as opposed to vision for a future, because freedom dream dictates that you need your dream for whatever a vision for a future might look like. If it ain't attached to the freedom of all of us, that ain't really a dream, because some people's, I like to say, some people's freedom dream can be other people's nightmares. So the way that we make that not possible is by having a politics that is so intersectional that we understand that the value of Black lives need to be central to that in order for us to execute it.
Thank you so much. Right? Snaps, that deserves some snaps for sure.
Yeah.
All right. So I think it's time for the Q&A. And to start off, I had a couple of questions I had made. And then at the end, we're going to have student-made questions directed specifically towards each of you. So I'll go ahead and start off with my first question, which is, how has your work as activists and artists shaped your views towards the fight for Black liberation and against white supremacy? And as a follow-up to that, are there any works that inspired you to become involved in the efforts for Black liberation or anything like that? Bree, you can, Bree or Darnell, you can start off. Yeah, it doesn't matter.
Sure. Yes, I mean, I think for me, it has been a journey to that point of recognizing exactly what Darnell was speaking to, because I actually went to school to study filmmaking. And I remember, like, I was, the way that my parents raised me, definitely be aware of like your history, be aware of where you came from, and, fight the good fight. But there was also like this kind of sense that we had other people had fought and died and sacrificed and gone to jail. So like we got to a certain point where I wouldn't have to. And then when I realized that was not the case, like we were going to have to, step up on the front line and do the same things. I just kind of remember having this point at which I was like, let me put all that to the side, like what I was trying to do, and let me just throw myself 100% into the movement. And it kind of took me a while to really recognize that art and creativity are an essential part of movement and always have been. Like I didn't necessarily make that connection right away for myself. And so now I have like really kind of arrived, even though I was making art in the whole time, I was making like message tees. I did like, create this shirt. It's like people over money. I'm, thinking through creatively, like how are we, at demonstrations, how are we communicating the message? Taking down the flag. It was not just, scaling the pole and taking down the flag, but thinking through like, what is the visual that we are creating? How are we creating like an image of, liberation, in this moment? But that really kind of took me, it took me a moment to really arrive at that point. And again, I always define it as just the journey of consciousness, right? Because you can be doing something without being conscious of it. It doesn't mean that we're not already doing it. Like, I think exactly like what Darnell was saying, I think art has always been a part of the movement, whether we're conscious of it or not, but there's a power in operating with consciousness. And so once I kind of like recognize that, then I go back and I'm studying like, the Black arts movement, and I'm studying like, how essential that creative work, that intellectual work is to moving things forward. Just as vital as the folks who are like, organizing movement and building political organization are the writers and the theorists who are informing that and who are helping us, through art and music and writing, interpret what it is that we are all going through. And I think all of that kind of informs like this collective consciousness, that we are participating in, which we can be participating in without being aware of it. But I do think that art has this unique way of bringing to the forward of our consciousness, that which is kind of already there in a way, if that makes sense.
Yes.
Absolutely. Thank you, Bree.
Yeah. For me, I'm thinking about my own journey to grow my consciousness, my own journey to grow my awareness. I would say to start, I always name home as my standpoint. I grew up in Camden, New Jersey, in the sort of, as AIDS was ravaging our community, in the center of hip hop, as it's sort of blossoming as a cultural production, in a community that the media and some social scientists had named as a ghetto. So it's in this place where, without having a theoretical language to attach to what I was experiencing, I learned very quickly, from a son who was born to a mama at 16 who had to stop going to school to raise her son, who then relied on the state on some occasions to support us, who was also being beat by her male partner. I didn't have intersectionality as a framework at that moment as a child, but what I knew was like, wait, my mama, she got like, I was clear, like she has to sort of war against the fist of the state, the fist of her male intimate partner, the fist of a society that tells her that, you had this child at a wet, like, by the way, the same year she had me was the same year that Ronald Reagan went on a campaign trail using the term welfare queens to describe women like my mama, who was assumed to be sucking the state of its resources. Now, what I'm trying to get at is, as young people, as a young person, I had a good sense of what was happening in the world, what was happening in my community, and why my community looked different than other people. And I think that was at the sort of grounds of a consciousness raising. It was the people who came along, the communities in which I was a part, that began to provide me with the optics, the lenses, the analytical tools, the stories, the sort of research, the cultural work to help me name what I always knew to be true. So I want to name, my organizing work in like Newark as an example. That's where I really learned to organize. It was none of that stuff was blasted on the media. This was like work that people did after we left our full-time jobs. We went and did our other full-time jobs in the street. There was no news articles being raised about the types of work we were doing in the community. And it was there where I learned the value of organizing that had less to do with branding, that had less to do with like being out in the world. Like it had to do with ensuring that our communities had what they needed, that the people, the most marginalized in our communities had what they need. June Dalberton, who I try to name people, right, was a Black lesbian woman who in 2000, or early 2000 said, come help us on the streets, come help us organize folk. It was in community there where my consciousness was raised, where my assumptions and my biases were being challenged, where I was made to consider what the limits of my own politics were. You can't have that type of work done if you're not in community with people to help shape how sometimes we in this type of world, it's like, I'm gonna just go out here and become a thing. I'm gonna go out here and become, but it is through community where we get the knowledges that we need to sort of do the work that we need to do. It's in community. I'll give you one example of a story to sort of talk about the connections between community and politics and cultural work. It was we were standing outside of the City Hall in Newark when Cory Booker was in office, and we were protesting or shutting down a council or something like that. And Cheryl Clark, who was a Black lesbian, feminist, poet, and scholar, Dr. Cheryl Clark, and Amiri Baraka was there at the same time. Now, this is a history course, so I want y'all, if y'all don't know these names, to write them down and go look them up, because you would understand how critical of a moment it was to have Cheryl Clark and Amiri Baraka present at City Hall, pushing the city council to not privatize their water system. Now, if you don't, let me give you a little history backstory and why this is important. Cheryl Clark in 1980 criticized the hell out of Amiri Baraka, who was understood and named as one of the fathers of the Black arts movement. Cheryl Clark is a poet, and what she critiqued him for was his centralizing principle of patriarchy. She said, y'all down for the Black cause, but it's patriarchal, hyper patriarchal. It's not queer affirming. You don't make space for women. Like, she went off on this. It's called the failure of homophobia in the Black community. Mm-hmm. She goes off on him. Now, 2 decades later, they're appearing together at the same protest, having grown over 20 years and he grew because of her criticism, the critique that she offered. Not only did he grow because of the critique, but what you'll find out for someone who was critiqued, rightly so, for not being friendly to queer people, for actually being a hater of queer people, he ends up having a Black lesbian daughter who was murdered by her sister's partner. So a big part of his second half of his life, which talks about how we can grow as people, he and his wife, Amina, they focused their energies, even in ways that he failed to do because of his own homophobia, on queer folk. Now, I learned from those type of, I was able to be in a room with Cheryl and Amiri and like learn from them. And what I discovered is that we all are on a continuum of growth. We don't ever show up knowing all the things. And the moment that we feel like we do is the moment that we lose on self, the moment that we lose on community. Like, I don't wake up every day feeling like I know it. I learn every day, and how I open up my mind and my heart to learn from those who are alongside of me. I guess the last thing I'll say here then is, as an artist, what's been clear for me, and I don't know if I've always seen this done in a lot of the work in like Black literature, but I'm of a particular body of people, and I should name the people that shaped me: June Jordan and Audre Lorde, Joseph Beeman, Essex Hemphill, Marlon Riggs, Assata Saint. I mean, there are so many, and Bell. Like, there are people who I was able to read, but also who became mentors to me that taught me, like Cheryl, like Bell. And one of the things that has been really clear, and this is a lesson that I'm learning really from feminists, is the practice of self-reflexive analyses. Sounds really fancy. But for me as a writer, it's important for me not just to sort of write a critique about the systems that are at work in dangerous ways on my life if I am not invested in locating the ways that I too can be and am complicit in things that can then impact upon other people. And the way I say it is, we always think about whose feet are on our necks. Rarely do we think about the necks that our feet are on. So as an artist, my work is about exploring that second question. Whose necks are my feet on? And then the third part of that, what do I need to do to get it off? Because if we can't get to that aspect of a political imagination, then we can easily be complicit. Even, like I said before, be up here with our fist up in the air and hating the hell out of trans folk. That's not liberatory. That's not Black liberation. So what I've learned, what was bequeathed to me through Black feminist learnings, Black queer learnings, was this idea of self-reflexive analyses. And I try to practice that within my art making.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. All right, so for our next question, you guys kind of already touched on this, but I'll just ask it again just to set the stage. What actions do you think Americans and I guess people across the globe will need to take in order for Black people to become fully liberated and respected in society? And as a follow-up to that, do you guys think respectability is something African Americans should even aim for alongside their fight for Black liberation?
Sure, do you want me to go first again?
Yes, Bree. Yes,
okay, yeah, sure. So, I mean, everything, like, you know, I mean, I think one of my major, I don't know if the word is critiques or what, I guess observations, right? I would say one of my observations is that people really underestimate the pervasiveness of anti-Black racism. And I feel like that comes up again and again and again when we're trying to unpack a lot of these different systems of oppression. Is just really understanding how the extent to which the modern world has been constructed around these ideas of anti-Black racism. And this is a modern invention. And again, kind of going back to what I was saying in the first statement that I gave about recognizing like the world before this system that we live under, right, is really understanding how it was like a conscious step-by-step development into being what we are right now. And so that thing has to be deconstructed. But part of it is really recognizing how much it is built into every single thing. I saw like where this week people were really dissecting anti-Black racism in artificial intelligence, right? And I think that is just like again like a modern reflection of what has happened with every single other thing, whether it's religion, whether it's science, whether it's the economy, right? These ideas around what it means to be Black and what it means to be white, and how these two things exist in relationship to each other, and where everybody else falls on that spectrum, and just the whole worldview understanding. Even the way that our maps are laid out, I was just thinking about that recently, like this idea that there's a North and the South, and the way that we define our understanding of the West, or defining the history of America is starting from the East Coast to the West Coast, because that follows the expansion of white settler colonialism, right? This idea that when we look at the world and the way that our globes and our maps have been designed, center everything from the perspective of the white colonizers. Like when we are talking about what do we have to do in order to undo anti-Black racism, I think it's absolutely everything. And I think it's exactly what Darnell was talking about. It's not just about the systems that are oppressing us. We have to do that work within ourselves, because we have internalized all of this. It's kind of like if you are a fish in a pond, it's not just about the water, but you are taking that water in. Like every single day, you are absorbing everything that is in there. And so we have to really, again, going back to that word conscious. I mean, I don't know how else you do that except to consciously do it, because the thing about white supremacy and the pervasiveness of this ideology is that people move in it unconsciously. That's why whenever we start talking about anti-Black racism, or we say Black lives, that's when everything comes to a standstill. Like you don't have to go out and organize people in this society to live according to the ideology of white supremacy, because they are raised in it nonstop all the time without having to think about it, right? It's trying to do the opposite that requires that kind of conscientious work, and then understanding the global nature of it as well. And I don't think that there really is, I mean, in my view, I'm sure there's a lot of ways to go about it, but I certainly don't think there's a way to go about it without consciousness of history. That's why we have this whole battle going on right now, this whole, 1619 project versus, what did he call it, the 1776 commission or something like that, right? I mean, that's an example of that tension, because see, we're not supposed to operate with an understanding of how race is an invention, and why race was invented. That's the other thing too, not just how it is an invention, but why it was invented in service to this capitalist economy that we live under now, right? And part of why we are kind of like in this like moment of crisis, this like existential crisis that the white supremacist state is going through right now, is because when you start pulling at that thread, the whole thing unravels. And so I think like there is no, I don't think you can name any aspect, any industry of modern human society that is untouched by anti-Black racism. I just don't think you can.
Absolutely. Darnell?
I literally can just sit here and listen to Bree. I'm just like,
All day,
I'm just gonna sit here and take notes. How about that? All of that, and simply I do inevitably, and I don't say this as a pessimist statement, nor as something that is like nihilistic. I fundamentally believe that the only way that we can get to a new world is to build it, which requires an undoing of the world as we know it. And let me be clear, that isn't just in terms of structure, right? Like it's and not an undoing without, again, borrowing from Ruthie Wilson Gilmore, the work of imagining into being and building the things that actually are equitable, are just, are right for our life, for livability, in place of the things that don't work. We have, I like to say as a country, we love to lie. We love to lie. And what that would mean is that we would need to begin to tell the truth. And if we were to tell the truth, it will reveal that so much of what we say are undergirding our democratic principles, have not, you want to talk about dreams not being fulfilled, right? So for me, it is an undoing and a remaking of a world, which, if you're thinking about this through the lenses of a freedom dream, is not without hope, because it means if we know that stuff is not working, and if we know that there are technologies and mechanisms through which are eating away at the lives of people, to imagine what needs to go, the project of reconstruction, of abolition across a long arc of history was absolutely about repair. There's a book by Catherine Franke you all should read, and it's called Repair, and it's about, she's looking at the arc of abolitionism. And what abolitionists were saying is, here is where we are, and here's what is at work via the state, and the ways in which it's impacting upon indigenous folk, of the formerly enslaved folk. And here are the things in which, because we purposefully put them in place, have kept access to this idea of America from the very people you're saying these laws have been introduced to now usher them into. And it was about a remaking of the world. Remember, to get to Reconstruction was a remaking of a world. This was a world in which people that were fought their way. I don't want to just say like the ending of slavery was something that just was given over, right? That came with the fight. Imagine waking up in a world and you're no longer enslaved by virtue of law. That was an abolitionist politic in practice. So what must we do to get to another world? Undo the things that are not at work right now. And that's where the hope comes in for me. That's where the freedom dream aspect of this comes into me. And as it relates, and part of that, to Bree's point, is absolutely an undoing of the monsters that are within us. You breathe racism like air. We breathe patriarchy like air. We breathe xenophobia like air. We breathe trans antagonism like air. And let me tell you something, not only do we breathe it, once you figured out that for some of us, it is exactly the thing that keeps you moving, that keeps you closest to power, you don't want to stop breathing it. You don't want to let go of it. So you have to undo it. Like I didn't sort of like wake up one day and say, hey, I'm going to like not be trans antagonistic. I had to work on myself. I had to ask myself questions. I didn't wake up one day and was like, hey, let me just stop being sexist. I had to engage with Black feminist writings. I had to think about my mama and my sisters and look myself in the mirror and evaluate the extent to which, even as a person who was talking about Black liberation as a queer man, I was still holding on and still benefit to this day from patriarchy. And the way that I get free from it is by every day fighting against it. So you can remake the world. Like, you know, there's this, I always like to use these scripture references, but like putting old wine into wine skins. We can have an entirely new world, but if we are walking into that world still smelling and reeking of the very thing that we're saying we're moving from, nothing will change. That will change only when we are ready to have a revolution inside of self. Of revolution inside it. And that's not even no like new age psychology shit I'm talking about. That's like real waking up every day, evaluating, asking ourselves questions, questioning ourselves and doing something about it. And with regards to respectability, just as context, there's a way that the word is thrown around and sometimes in ways that are not wholly just to how it was conceptualized as a theory. That term was coined by Evelyn Higginbotham in 1993 in her book specifically called Righteous Discontent, where she's looking as a historian at Black women churchgoers at a very particular point in civil rights history. And what she was talking about with regards to respectability were the ways that these Black women would make certain choices about how they would engage and be in the world, not because they were interested in trying to be like the white majority class, but because they understood that they needed to lessen the blow of anti-Black racism. They did that by making choices about a variety of different ways of being and expressing themselves in the world, of engaging in a type of respectable type of living so as to mitigate harm. And that's really, really important to name because we throw it around as a sort of a read of Black folk. Oh, you know, that respect, you're just being respectable, as opposed to thinking about what it meant in historical context when you're like, I don't know, leaving church and got to go to the Woolworth to drink water at the back of the store that said Black only signs. They were trying to think, we're already out here facing so many arrows, so many racialized arrows are coming up at us. What can we do in such a way that we can mitigate against that harm for our families, for our kids? So that's the context. Now, what does that mean then to sort of apply that and think about it in our now? Now, I think what you're getting at in a question is, can we, to borrow Audre Lorde's words, utilize the master's tools to dismantle the master's house, right? Well, on some occasions, we will always answer no. Because we know that the tools was never made for our making. So what I'm trying to say is, I think the work, again, is not necessarily this game of examining sort of who's moving, flexing respectability politics or not, because that takes us away from how it was initially conceived. I think the move is to always be asking ourselves, is what we are doing, how we're expressing what we're thinking, the ideologies, our practices liberatory for Black people?
Can I add something real quick to that? Because I
Yes,
realize that
please.
Of course.
Like, I do think, first of all, amen to everything Darnell said, everything he has said. I do think it is important to recognize that even the notion of what is respectable is always going to be anti-Black. Like, I mean, and I think like the past, 12 years, just if we just narrow in on like Obama versus Trump is a perfect demonstration of that, because it's like, it doesn't matter what is the standard, what standard meets respectability for Black people will never, it's always going to be a double standard. And so like, even to the extent that we try to mitigate harm, and I mean, and completely recognizing like the original context of it, that oftentimes just results in white people escalating the violence more. It's like, how dare you try to put on a suit and be a man?
Because you're still going to church and we're still going to bomb the church.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Well, our next question, this is coming directly from the students, and I'm going to have it be answered by Bree only. And then I'll have a question for you, of course, Darnell. So your question, Bree, is, so her statement in the beginning was, your defiance against the culture of white supremacy is brave and inspiring. How did the community around you react to your removal of the Confederate flag? Were they overwhelmingly supportive, or were they in opposition of what you did?
Oh, I appreciate that. That's a really good question. It was really interesting. So the thing that was fascinating about that is, see, there were the people around me who like knew me, right? Like people that I'm like really in community with. And of course, those folks are some of the most supportive people, especially the people that were a part of it. First of all, for anybody that doesn't know, I did not do that on my own. It was not just me hopping up one day. Like I worked with a community of activists to make that action happen. And so, you know, my family, my friends, everybody, you know, apart from, you know, wanting me to be safe, you know, and having just, you know, concerns about that, people were very supportive. What was interesting to observe, though, was kind of like the larger response from people who did not know me, but were simply reacting to the image of a Black woman, right? Just a Black woman taking down the flag. That, for some people, loved it, absolutely loved it. For other people, they had different kinds of reactions to it, because that is again like that is a violation of the status quo. That's a deep violation of the status quo. You know, what is supposed to happen is either we wait for South Carolina, the state of South Carolina, and the white power structure to decide whether or not, you know, the flag comes down, or it looks some other type of way. But it's not, you know, some people felt, I've had people remark to me that they thought it should have been a man, you know, who was in that role, you know. You know, and again, it's not necessarily about people reacting to Bree Newsom Bass and what Bree Newsom Bass did. It's specifically about this image of a Black feminine figure acting with that kind of agency, right? And acting in defiance of the white power structure that makes the action still controversial to this day. I mean, controversial to the point that they really have tried as much as they could to really try to erase what actually happened. I mean, we talk about like constant historical erasure. There was an immediate effort in the aftermath of that action to try to rewrite what we had all just witnessed. I mean, we all witnessed the massacre in Charleston. We witnessed South Carolina refuse to lower the flag under any circumstances. They were not trying to take that flag down at all. We all know that that flag was raised in the 60s as a statement of opposition to the civil rights movement. That's what that flag had always represented. And then we saw a Black woman scale the pole and take it down herself. And that was, to defy in that way, it wasn't, it was controversial, not just because of that, but because of what it represented, right? And that's, again, like when we talk about like the freedom dream, right? And talking about like the future. And I mean, that was part of what we were trying to do with that action. It was not just about committing an act of civil disobedience around that particular flag, but the purpose of the flag, the purpose of the display of something like that is to remind everybody that white supremacy is the power of the day. That is the order of the day. We say it's going to stay up there. Y'all can't say anything about it. And so to have, if somebody can just scale up there and take it down, then what does that say about what we could all possibly do to the white power structure? You know what I mean? So that is really what people are reacting to, whether positively or negatively.
Absolutely, I agree. All right, so question for you, Darnell. What has it been like being involved with the feminist movement, Black Lives Matter movement, LGBTQ plus movements simultaneously, and how has that impacted your identity?
Yeah, before I even respond to that, I just wanted to say, like, I was one of those people that was so moved by you, Bree. And this is why, like, I think art and cultural representation is so important. Like that image, the act, and then the image is such a powerful reminder of how something like a cultural representative, like you on a pole and a picture of you, can do so much to move people, can shift the ways that we think. And we have to be thinking about art then, again, as a tool for social change. Like I am still and deeply bowing, like because of just the power that you represented through that. Like I'm still moved to this day. That will be a thing that we will remark upon, and for many of us be stitched in our imagination. And that image alone can be the fuel to move somebody else forward. So I just want to say that. But for me, I guess simply in response, like there is no disconnection between any of those things that you just named. My understanding of a project of Black liberation, a life shaped by Black liberation, is one that sees no disconnect between ensuring that the rights of queer and trans and non-binary folk are secured. It sees no disconnect between an undoing and a challenging of patriarchy and an ending of rape culture and sexism, because some of the Black are women and non-binary and femme. Some of the Black are working poor. Some of the Black are disabled. So I struggle to see a differentiation, but between any of the, like, that is what it means for me to name myself as a part of a Black liberation movement. I struggle when we don't see those connects. And I understand why, when for so long there have been strains, iterations of Black movement that have only centered men, that have only proffered the voices of men, that have cis men, right? That have dismissed and visibilized the labor of Black women, of queer people, as if queer and trans folk didn't just show up in the movement. They always been here. They always been fighting. Women didn't just, it's not like we just know women elevate. I mean, we can go down the line, but that we don't know their names says something about the dangerous ways that our movements have been hijacked and organized around patriarchy, around cis heteronormativity. So I actually feel like the more I am challenged, and I said this earlier, to expand my political imagination, the more I am better able to show up in solidarity with folk. On the other hand, I'm very clear that there are streams of movements that themselves have very much been shaped by anti-Blackness, that have very much been shaped by their antagonism to trans folk. You can be in what we might call a, quote, LGBT movement, walk during Pride, I'm queer. Like, I've been at Pride marches, and I also been at Pride marches on Christopher Street when Black Lives Matter protesters shut things down, and you had our queer folk out there that was screaming for them to get out the way. So on the other hand, I guess as my centralizing point, I'm always ensuring that at the heart of anything that calls itself a movement, if it is not intersectional, ain't moving at all. And I ain't part of it. So look, I can't be calling myself part of a project of Black liberation if I don't understand how the fight for the rights and also sanctity of life for undocumented people is also my fight. So for me, those things are never, ever disconnected at all.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So my next question, and you guys can both answer this how you please. Environmental injustice and environmental racism in general has remained a persistent problem in Pittsburgh, to be specific, for decades, impacting the city's Black residents the most. So how do you recommend our community here at the University of Pittsburgh and our surrounding communities respond to this type of injustice, especially the air and water pollution that we face here in Pittsburgh?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I can jump in there. I mean, so first of all, I want to say, like, I have so much respect for everyone that is doing work around environmental racism. That is something that again, talking about consciousness shifting, I had to come into an awareness of that. Because I honestly used to view environmentalism as like this kind of like, when I heard environmentalism, I pictured white people hugging trees. I'll be honest. You know what I mean? Like, I really had to come into and understand, like, no, like, it's our people that are being most immediately impacted, by these issues. And it goes back to structures. I mean, it is structural. Like everything else, it is informed by white supremacy and capitalism and the whole worldview, the whole way we approach the living earth and peoples and lands. I think that, again, in terms of talking about like structural transformation, especially when we're looking at the universities, I frankly think that the universities themselves have to transform what they are as institutions, because like historically, these were institutions that were created to serve the elite, to prepare the elite to continue being the elite, and so I think when we talk about how can like an institution of higher learning work with the surrounding community, I think that has to then become the transformative goal of the institution, is not to just like raise up an elite class of people who rule over everybody else, but that the institution serves the community that surrounds it. You know, we've had like a lot of this tension that's been going on with a lot of campuses, where the campuses are contributing to the gentrification and displacement, you know, of the community. And I've definitely, you know, been invited to community or to, you know, campuses, and just have witnessed some of that dynamic where there may be an event on campus, but the surrounding community doesn't feel like it's for them, or they don't feel like they're welcome, you know, in the space necessarily. And so I think, like, how can you use like the resources of the institution, and part of the work that I do now, my work that I've been doing most recently has been around housing, but I think some of these same things apply. What I see in working on the housing issue is that some of the people who have the most brilliant out the box ideas about how to solve the issue are the people who are most directly impacted. I mean, like, you know, we keep having these discussions and debates about, you know, theory and practice, and where does theory come from? And do people who, you know, do you have to go to university to understand theory? People are theorizing in their everyday lives about how to respond to what they are experiencing. And I think if we could connect those things, like if we can connect resources and institutional power to, you know, people who are like directly impacted, I think that's where we can really come up with solutions, you know, that really transform things, you know, and really move us from just like people kind of theorizing in a lab to really doing something that has world impact.
Absolutely. There's power in the people that are experiencing the theory that we read. I think that's very important to know. Yes, Darnell.
I love that response. And just as for me to take a step back for, you know, I tell this story about understanding how or what environmental racism looks like. So I grew up in Camden, as I mentioned, and as a child, I lived in South Camden, which is near the port area. And I always said as a child, the neighborhood smelled like shit. Y'all pardon my term here, but it did. Like I would just like, it smells like, it's like, it smelled like shit. And as a child, that's what I knew. And I knew that when I left my neighborhood to go to other neighborhoods, particularly suburban, like close suburban locales, it didn't. I'm like, it smells different here. And I recognized that there was a waste management. I didn't know this as a child. I didn't know it was a waste management plant, but I knew that there was a big factory behind our home. Now, as I got older and I did research, I discovered that there was a calculated political decision that had been made, because Camden is the county seat. That means it's the centralized municipality within in New Jersey. Like the surrounding areas are all part of a county. Camden is the county seat. And the other suburban neighborhoods, many of them are predominantly homeowners, predominantly white, predominantly, if not white, or Black, middle class and up, voted to have their shit and trash sent to Camden, which is predominantly Black and Latinx, predominantly working poor, to be treated. Now, I want you all to hear this, right? So it's not just like there was this environmental impact that did not have, that was not the result of people's calculated political decisions. The politicians in power made all manner, along with business owners, homeowners, et cetera, all manner of decisions. They made legislation such that the trash and feces was being treated in a predominantly Black and working poor neighborhood and away from the suburban areas where it could have been treated. That is what you call environmental racism. When structural decisions are made that have environmental consequences. So in that neighborhood, there are high rates of asthma, as one example, right? That are factored by our calculations of whose lives are worth it and whose lives aren't. Because if it were the case that this was just about a waste management plan, surely there is lots of land, undeveloped land in suburban areas where that could have gone. But a calculation was made about the worthiness of lives, the mattering of people's lives, such that they put it in a densely populated city. And I had to grow up under the smell of garbage that was actually impacting upon our health. That said, like Bree said, universities have to decentivize those type of decisions. They have to purposefully and actively, because they are now, particularly in neighborhoods where, and part of the political infrastructure, the economic infrastructure, particularly for universities that have high growth potential and are growing, you have to find out ways that you can then involve yourselves purposefully and actively in those decisions, and not just in preventing them, from undoing them, from undoing them. Like, that is our work. That is the work of the university when you're based in communities. And I love this idea that Bree is mentioning. If universities are to be spaces where we come to learn, to be educated, outside of those who have a right to it because they can afford it. But if the ultimate goal is for a sort of transforming of the world by the transforming of the mind, then a university should never see itself as a gated entity that protects its property, its ability to transform from the others that it's in community with. So therefore, it means for me that universities have a responsibility to take in undoing environmental racism.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. So for the last question before we wrap everything up, what are some texts you guys would recommend? And I'll say, like, give me like your top three. If you have like top two, you can do top two. But give me your top three texts you would recommend for anyone who wants to get started on reading about Black liberation theory, abolition, just all that in general.
So I think I'm like looking up here. So I think, let me grab one over. Oh, I got my pajama pants on. I want to show
Oh,
you.
you planned this. You knew I was going to ask the question.
So one I would definitely recommend from Black Liberation, from Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation by Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor is really good. You're like talking about something like introductory, because that she does a really good job of like breaking down kind of like the modern movement. And I would also really recommend, let's see. I would also recommend In Struggle by Carson, about the SNCC, like history of SNCC. Those are just like two I would recommend off top, like something that kind of like gives you a good overview of the modern movement and something that gives you like an understanding of its equivalent in the past, I would say.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Darnell?
Yeah, that's so, these are always difficult questions, but I mentioned Robin Kelly's Freedom Dreams and the Black Radical Imagination. I think that's a really good book to think about the role of art, Black art and culture in the shaping of movements, and also of politics. A book that we may not consider to be a movement text, but I would say is one that can enhance our consciousness, is Audre Lorde's Sister Outsider. And then, it's so hard to pick three. I'm literally looking at like all my books all over the place. But another contemporary book, and I feel like I'm missing so many. I am. That is what. Can I give you four? Let me just.
Yeah, you can give me as many as you want to. Listen.
There is Brittany Cooper's Eloquent Rage comes to mind, because it's a book that is written as a sort of first person narrative. It's not didactic. It's really a way to think into Black feminism, a sort of particular Black feminism that's attuned to sort of like this generation, as a good book. And then Heavy by Kiese Layman is another, and I'm giving memoirs because it might not sound like, because these books are not sort of historical narratives, that it doesn't come with a theoretical underpinning. But as an artist, again, I'm a writer, I'm always thinking about the ways that story can be useful for us to think about the theories that we are also thinking through. So like I told you a story about my mama, without ever using the word intersectionality, I wrote a book where in parts I talk about her life, so that when you get to a term like intersectionality, it will make sense. Heavy, An American Memoir is another one of those books that does that.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Darnell, and thank you so much to Bree for joining us today. I had a great time. I hope you guys also had a great time. And I think our students also enjoyed this conversation today. And I just want to kind of summarize by saying, I think a lot of what you guys talked about today was essentially just learning, right? Learning to unlearn the things that we've learned in the past and learning that we need to kind of apply ourselves in the future and apply ourselves to the theory and the individuals behind this theory, right? Because it's not just text that we're opening up in books or experiences we're having in the classroom and stuff like that. So I hope you guys are able to apply yourselves. I hope you guys are able to take some of these texts and some of these concepts that we talked about today and kind of conceptualize them and think about them as you go outside of the classroom. So thank you both for joining us today. I had an awesome time. And that is the end of our session.
Thank you. Thank you for being a
Thank you so
stellar
much.
moderator.
Of
Yes,
course.
absolutely. Thank you.